On December 12, 1942, the crews of the 6th Panzer Division climbed into their tanks at Kotelnikovo and started their engines. 300,000 German soldiers were starving inside Stalingrad, roughly 120 kilometers to the northeast. The 6th Panzer had 12 days of fuel, a week's worth of ammunition, and absolutely no margin for error. They would get within 48 kilometers of the pocket, close enough for men inside Stalingrad to see the flashes on the southern horizon, and then they would be ordered to turn around. So today we're going through the full story of Operation Winter Storm, how a single Panzer Division, freshly refitted from France, was thrown into the frozen steppe as the spearhead of the last realistic chance to save the 6th Army, what they ran into, how close they actually got, and why they were pulled back when they were almost there. By the time the 6th Army was officially encircled on November 23, 1942, roughly 300,000 German and Romanian soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. The Luftwaffe was supposed to keep the pocket supplied by air, but that was failing almost immediately. The pocket needed around 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe managed to deliver an average of about 105 tons. The men inside were already running out of food, ammunition, and medical supplies within the first 2 weeks. Manstein, newly appointed to command Army Group Don, understood the situation clearly. If the 6th Army was going to survive, someone had to break through from the outside, open a corridor, push supplies in, and get those men moving south. There was no other option. The original plan called for 2 relief thrusts, one from the Chir River front to the west, which was the shorter route at only about 65 kilometers. The other from Kotelnikovo to the south, which meant covering over 120 kilometers of open steppe. But Soviet attacks along the Chir tied down every unit Manstein had there. The western option was dead before it started. That left Kotelnikovo and the 57th Panzer Corps as the only card Manstein could play. And this is where General Erhard Rauss and the 6th Panzer Division enter the picture. The division had spent the last 6 months refitting in Brittany, France. It was close to full strength and had received brand new equipment. Its armoured fist was the 11th Panzer Regiment under Oberst Walter von Hunersdorf. The regiment had 21 Panzer IIs for reconnaissance, 75 Panzer III Model Js armed with the long 50mm gun, 30 Panzer III Model Ns carrying the short 75mm gun for infantry support, 24 Panzer IV Model Gs carrying the long 75mm gun, and 9 command tanks. Around 160 tanks total. By Eastern Front standards in late 1942, that was an enormous amount of armour for a single division. Okay, so here's where the tank stuff matters for understanding this story. The Panzer III Model J was the workhorse of this regiment. 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator. The long 50mm gun could penetrate the side and rear armour of a T-34 at combat ranges, but hitting one from the front was a different problem. You needed to be close, you needed a clean shot, and even then the round might bounce. The Panzer IV with its long 75 could handle a T-34 frontally at reasonable range, but there were only 24 of those in the entire regiment compared to 75 Panzer IIIs. So the majority of the men in the 11th Panzer Regiment were going into this fight, knowing that their main gun was marginal against the most common Soviet tank they would face. And then there was the cold. The 6th Panzer Division had received winterization equipment and antifreeze in France, which was more than most German units on the Eastern Front could say. But a Panzer III in -20 degrees Celsius is still a steel box that sucks heat out of everything it touches. Engines had to be warmed up for 30 minutes before they would run properly. Optics fogged up. Rubber seals cracked. The turret traverse could freeze if the grease congealed. Crews learned to keep their engines idling through the night, burning fuel they could not afford to waste because a tank that would not start in the morning was a 23-ton paperweight. One of those Panzer III commanders was Oberleutnant Horst Scheibert, serving as a company commander in the regiment. He would later write the most detailed account of this operation from inside the turret, drawing on war diaries, radio transcripts between Hunersdorf and division headquarters, and his own memory. The division's introduction to the Eastern Front set the tone for everything that followed. Rauss was summoned to meet Manstein at Kharkov station on November 24th. He later recalled that Manstein described the situation in very somber terms. 3 days later, the first trainload of the 6th Panzer Division pulled into Kotelnikovo station and was immediately greeted by Soviet artillery fire. The Panzer Grenadiers jumped from the wagons under shell fire, while Soviet infantry charged the station. The division was fighting before it had even finished unloading. The rest of the 57th Panzer Corps was not in nearly as good shape. The 23rd Panzer Division had been pulled from the Caucasus, with only about 30 operational tanks. The 17th Panzer Division, coming from Army Group Center, had roughly 60 tanks, but would not arrive until 4 days after the offensive began. The 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion, with its Tiger E's, was also promised, but would not reach the front until late December. So in practical terms, the 160 tanks of the 11th Panzer Regiment were the operation. Everything depended on Hunnersdorf's men getting through. At first light on December 12th, the 76th Artillery Regiment opened up on Soviet positions around Gremyashi Station, along the rail line northeast of Kotelnikovo. While the Panzer Grenadiers fixed the defenders at the bridgehead, the 11th Panzer Regiment burst out in a deep wedge formation. Panzer IVs forward with the Panzer IIIs echeloned behind and to the flanks. The advance was so fast that the 6th Panzer Division overran Soviet artillery positions before the guns could be turned or displaced. The Soviet 302nd Rifle Division of the 51st Army was effectively destroyed by the end of the first day. Scheibert later described that first day's advance. Snow was falling from their vehicle tracks. The crews were in frenzied spirits. They were firing at everything that appeared and pushing their machine guns to the limit. Soviet infantry scattered in every direction. He said they must have thought the Germans were madmen. By nightfall, the 6th Panzer Division had pushed nearly 50 kilometers and reached the southern bank of the Aksai River. It was the kind of pace that belonged to 1941, not the grinding winter of late 1942. But the distance they had to cover was enormous. The Mishkova River lay roughly 45 kilometers further north, and beyond the Mishkova, another 48 kilometers of steppe separated them from the Stalingrad pocket. Stavka had been caught by surprise. They had expected the relief attempt to come from the west along the Chir, not from Kotelnikovo to the south. And that miscalculation bought the 6th Panzer Division exactly 1 day of easy movement before the Soviets recovered. On December 13th, the 6th Panzer Division crossed the Aksai and reached the village of Verknik Kumsky. It sat on the only usable north-south road to Stalingrad. The steppe on either side was cut with ravines and gullies filled with deep snow, completely impassable for armoured formations. Any large armoured force heading north had to go through that village, and the Soviets knew it. The Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps under General Volsky was racing toward the same village from the opposite direction. Volsky had around 100 operational tanks, with another 50 in various states of repair. The 8th Cavalry Corps and elements of the 13th Tank Corps were also converging on the area. What followed was a 5-day armoured battle that General Raus later described as a gigantic wrestling match. On December 15th, roughly 200 German tanks clashed with about 400 Soviet tanks on the plains around Verknik Kumsky, and this is where the limitations of the Panzer III started showing. The Panzer IVs with their long 75mm guns could engage T-34s at 800 to 1,000 meters, but the Panzer III crews had to close to 500 meters or less to have a reliable chance of penetrating, and even then a frontal hit against the T-34's sloped armor could deflect. The tactical solution was to use the Panzer IIIs to fix Soviet armor in place, while the Panzer IVs and the anti-tank guns of Panzerjägerabteilung 41 did the killing. Hunnersdorf was a master of this kind of fluid, fast-moving engagement. He kept the regiment pivoting, outflanking Soviet concentrations, and using the terrain to set up kill zones rather than grinding head-on. The Luftwaffe flew close air support with Stukas hammering Soviet columns. The village changed hands multiple times. The fighting ran day and night. Crews were sleeping in their tanks between engagements, waking up to frozen controls and fogged optics. A tank that took a hit and could not move became a coffin. Temperatures dropped to -20 and below. Wounded men left outside froze to death before medics could reach them. By December 17th, the Soviets had lost enough armor at Verknik Kumsky to give the 6th Panzer Division a brief numerical superiority. But the cost was real. The regiment was burning through tanks, fuel, and men it could not replace. Damaged vehicles were hauled to the rear and repaired overnight by maintenance crews working in the open. Bare hands on frozen steel, trying to get every tank they could back into the fight by morning. And while the 11th Panzer Regiment was bleeding at Verknik Kumsky, something far worse was happening 200 kilometers to the northwest. On December 16th, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, smashing through the Italian 8th Army on Army Group Don's left flank. That offensive tore a massive hole in the German line and suddenly threatened the rear of the entire relief effort. Manstein now had two crises at once, but he pressed forward. There was no alternative. On December 19th, with the 17th Panzer Division finally in the line and covering his flanks, Hunersdorf's battle group made a bold armoured thrust northward and seized a bridgehead on the far side of the Mishkova River. At one point during the advance, the 6th Panzer Division engaged roughly 300 Soviet tanks at about 400 meters range and destroyed 34 T-34s. They were now 48 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. No obstacle stood between them and the besieged 6th Army. There was just one problem. The Hunersdorf group at the Mishkova was almost entirely tanks. The Panzer Grenadiers of Kampfgruppe Zollenkopf were still 30 kilometers behind, fighting their way forward. The 23rd and 17th Panzer Divisions were tied down, protecting the flanks. Hunersdorf's tanks could not advance further without infantry support. Fuel was running critically low, and ammunition was being expended faster than it could be resupplied. And right at this moment, the first units of General Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army began arriving at the Mishkova from the east. Fresh, full-strength divisions deploying straight off the march. By December 21st, there were 19.5 Soviet divisions with 149,000 men and over 600 tanks facing the 57th Panzer Corps, which now had fewer than 85 operational tanks between all three of its divisions. Manstein sent his intelligence chief, Major Eismann, into the Stalingrad pocket by Fieseler Storch to explain the plan to Paulus. The 6th Army needed to break out southward to link up with the relief force. The code word was thunderclap. But Paulus reported that he had only enough fuel for his remaining tanks to drive about 30 kilometers. The relief force was 48 kilometers away. There was an 18-kilometer gap that nobody could close. On December 22nd, at the Mishkova bridgehead, the 6th Panzer Division was still holding. Its crews had fought off repeated Soviet attacks. On the morning of December 23rd, orders came through for the 6th Panzer Division to prepare for one last push. More than 120 tanks, 40 assault guns, 24 armoured cars, and supporting infantry and engineers were assembled for the final breakthrough. The plan was to drive the remaining 48 kilometers with everything the division had left. Then a second order arrived that afternoon, cancelling the first. The 6th Panzer Division was to disengage immediately and withdraw. Operation Little Saturn had ripped apart the Italian 8th Army. Soviet forces were threatening Rostov-on-Don, and if Rostov fell, every German unit south of the Don would be cut off. Manstein needed the 6th Panzer Division to plug the gap. The relief attempt was over. The effect on the troops was immediate. Every soldier understood what the withdrawal order meant. The 6th Army was being abandoned. Scheibert later wrote that although no one had been informed about the reasons, both officers and men had a feeling that something very bad must have happened to force the supreme leadership to abandon hundreds of thousands of men to their fate. All sacrifices seemed to have been in vain, all successes without meaning. During the night of December 23rd to 24th, Christmas Eve, the 6th Panzer Division pulled out of its positions along the Mishkova and began marching west toward the Don. The 17th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, too weak to hold alone, fell back as well. By December 25th, Soviet forces were pressing hard against the retreating corps. Every kilometer the 6th Panzer had fought and bled for over the previous 11 days was given back. The 6th Army held out for another 5 weeks. On February 2nd, 1943, the last organized resistance in Stalingrad ceased. Roughly 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Around 27,000 of them died within weeks. Fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany, most not until 1955. The 6th Panzer Division did not get to rest. It was thrown immediately into the defensive fighting west of the Don, holding a long front between the Bystraya and Kalitva rivers against continuous Soviet attacks. By New Year's Day 1943, barely 3 weeks after Winter Storm began, the 11th Panzer Regiment was down to 10 operational tanks out of an authorized strength of 160. Hunnersdorf was promoted to command the entire 6th Panzer Division in February 1943. He led it through Manstein's counterattack at Kharkov and into Operation Citadel at Kursk that summer. Scheibert survived the war. He became a military historian and spent the rest of his life writing about armoured warfare. His account of the operation was first published in German in 1956 under the title Bis Stalingrad 44 Kilometer, 48 kilometers to Stalingrad. He chose that number for the title because it was the distance that defined everything. Close enough to see the flashes, not close enough to matter. Manstein had done everything right. He struck from an unexpected direction, achieved surprise, and his spearhead punched through to the last river barrier. But he could not make Paulus break out. He could not stop little Saturn from collapsing his flank, and he could not be in two places at once. The men of the 6th Panzer Division drove within 48 kilometers of Stalingrad, and that was as close as anyone ever got.